Welcome to Capitol Forum, our chance to speak to leaders in law, business, and policy. I'm your host, Jack Calvertinas. Today we are welcoming Jonathan Turner, Chief Compliance Officer at Zoll Medical, as well as Pat Fogarty, Senior Vice President of Legal at AdvaMed. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you for having us. Pleasure to be here.
Appreciate you all being here at the historic Willard Hotel at Bigwig Studios, where I know the industry has been many times talking about these very issues that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. On the way in, Jack, I was talking to Jonathan saying that we're typically here at the Willard for our December board meetings, and it's usually set up with the Christmas arrangement. So it's always fun to come back to the Willard, and thanks again for having us. I want to say a special thank you to Jonathan for joining us today. Jonathan, as you know, is a leader in the compliance space for the medtech industry, and I really appreciate you being able to make it here, Jonathan. Thank you.
Really honored to be able to be here with you both.
This should be a good discussion, and just building on that whole thing about where we are here at the Willard. I remember joining my old company and attending meetings here on the Code of Ethics, where our CEO, Joe Almeida, and former chair of AdvaMed used to lead these important discussions on one of the many revisions to this important code that we're going to be speaking about today.
Yeah, that hits close to home right there. That's nice.
Yep. Well, Jonathan, let's start with you. I'd like to really talk to you first about your career at Zoll and what sort of led you to this commitment of yours to the industry's code of ethics.
Really appreciate that, Jack, and this has been a big part of what we in the industry have done. We're committed to patient care as our highest priority, but in the medical device space, we work very collaboratively with regulators, with providers, with hospitals, with patients, and of course the manufacturers themselves to help solve problems. And it's very important to us that we get that right. So we put a lot of emphasis not just on the what can we do, but on the what should we do. And the AdvaMed Code has been a big driver of that for us.
Appreciate that. And Pat, you and I have worked together. Tell us about what you're working on now. I know that you are, and Chris White as General Counsel, real leaders within the industry to sort of bring together not only the legal community, but also the linkage point with government affairs and policy and communications and regulatory.
Yeah, no, thanks for saying that. So yes, the code is always at the forefront of what we're doing at AdvaMed, of course, but recently on the government affairs side, you know, MDUFA has been huge. I think we're in the fifth cycle of MDUFA now. Janet Trunzo has been leading the way there for us, along with Greg Christ and his team and Kim Zimmerman. So it's hopefully in the rearview mirror soon, and then we can get back to everyday life.
That is a key moment in time, and I know I worked on those issues with Janet and the team, and then actually joined the FDA and was on the other side of the table, and then back again. So God bless the industry for continuing those important discussions. I know we share a love of golf as well.
Yeah, interesting weekend. I was cheering for Rory, but Cam seems to be a good guy, so nice job over at St. Andrews.
Yep. Well, Pat, I saw the news concerning the new AdvaMed Code of Ethics, and sort of before we get into the details of it, if you could just sort of give folks an idea of the background and the history of the AdvaMed Code of Ethics and sort of what led to these revisions to the code.
Yeah, sure. And Jonathan, feel free to jump in if I miss anything here, but the code essentially outlines the relationships between healthcare providers as well as in industry. And we're in a unique situation when it comes to medtech in terms of the training involved with our products. So I really think the code is kind of the guiding light when it comes to ethical interactions with healthcare providers. Believe it or not, the code has been around for 3-4 decades. I think when most people think of the AdvaMed Code, they're going back to the early 2000s. I think it was 2003 when the code was rebranded and relaunched. And then we've seen a few revisions through the years. I can talk about that here briefly, but I think the code really is what puts AdvaMed and the medtech industry at the forefront of its leadership in ethics and compliance.
Appreciate that, Pat. Let me turn to you, Jonathan. As Pat mentioned, you're really one of the most active members in the entire compliance community within this important industry. And tell us what you've sort of seen over the years, which really drives the industry to maintain such high ethical standards.
Well, as I mentioned before, it's a real strong focus on patient care and making sure that you want to get this right. We have the ability today through technologies that didn't exist before to extend people's lives, to transform the way they interact with their family members, how long they interact with their family members. And it's just been a huge guiding principle. But knowing that we're all operating on the same level playing field, knowing that we're protecting providers' independent medical decision making, knowing that we're putting the best quality products out, and knowing that we're developing the next generation of products and technologies for patients who need them is what keeps us on that sort of straight and true path.
You know, I come from a family of physicians, so if you could just speak a little bit more to that very important point about protecting physicians' independent decision making. I think that our viewers would be interested in that, whether they're physicians or not.
Sure. As we think about this, right, every patient is a unique person. They have different specific health needs. And so the industry works very collaboratively with physicians to make sure that the full range of the solutions is known and understood so that your doctor can make the right choice for your care. And that flexibility is why we have to have a very clear code of ethics, and AdvaMed has led on that, but also why that collaboration is so different from some of our other groups like pharma and bio and others, where they're a little bit more removed and maybe a little bit more scientific. We've got to be very, very flexible and very collaborative in the approach.
Thank you, Jonathan. Now, Pat, you talked earlier about the need for the industry to sort of refresh the code. If you could talk to us about that process, because I'm sure it is an important yet complicated one to do that over a period of time.
Yeah, that's an understatement. I'll start by saying that if somebody's not familiar with every aspect of AdvaMed, from what I've found, they're familiar with the AdvaMed Code. So we really take pride in the code. So that's first and foremost. When it comes to the revisions, I mentioned earlier that the code goes back decades. This most recent set of revision, which went into effect June 1st, is a result of an OIG special fraud alert that came around in November of 2020. We've been working 12 to 18 months to try to figure out this latest round of revisions. I kind of mentioned briefly at the outset the guiding factor that the code plays for AdvaMed, and we really look at the values of the code when it comes to integrity, transparency, respect, responsibility. And we had three areas that we really wanted to focus on with these revisions. The three areas: one, we wanted to focus on value-based arrangements. That seems to be a hot topic now in medtech. We also wanted to focus on some of the differences we're seeing now in terms of virtual meetings and virtual training programs. And then lastly, we wanted to focus on and highlight the use of digital data and AI when it comes to medtech. So that's really what we've been focusing these revisions on. And I foresee the code continuing to be the best pathway forward for the medtech industry when it comes to compliance.
So Pat, just building on that answer, could you talk to us a little bit more about the AI revisions? Because I'm sure that's something that you all didn't even think about 10 years ago.
Yeah, no, that's definitely, I can do that. So folks are thinking when they hear virtual, they automatically think about the pandemic and Microsoft Teams and Zoom. Truth be told, we've been thinking about the AI edits for nearly a decade, as you say. So yes, the pandemic has pushed us along when it comes to working in a virtual world, when it comes to meetings and training. But when it comes to AI and data, I mean, MedTech's been thinking about this and implementing AI for at least the past decade. So yes, this is definitely long overdue when it comes to these revisions.
Thank you. And Jonathan, you mentioned earlier about, briefly, the comparisons to other codes like pharmas and biologics. Could you please dig into that a little bit more and talk to us about the contrast between this code and theirs?
Yeah, so I think they're more alike than they are different. There's tremendous similarities. You know, ethical interactions are going to be very, very similar, but the industries do have some intrinsic differences. So if you look across the difference between med device to pharma, or if you look across the difference between the US to Europe and other parts of the world, you'll find some nuanced differences in the codes, partially probably based on who put them together. But I think at their core, they say most of the same things, which is we want to make sure that the way we interact hits what we would all feel comfortable with, the way we would want to be treated, and the way we'd want our family members to be treated. Now, there are some specific differences. So, for example, if you're implanting a device in a body or you're putting somebody into a machine for a test, it is fundamentally different than if you're prescribing a drug, which is basically a biochemistry study. And I'm not minimizing the importance of pharmaceuticals, but the approach and the interactions can have some very, very important nuances that are different. So we collaborate closely with our colleagues on the pharmaceutical side. In my own past, I've worked for companies that had both pharmaceutical and device products. They're all really important patient care tools, but the differences do matter, and I think it's an important distinction in the codes.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I'm sure this is interesting because your industry has leading members who are both medical device and pharmaceutical companies with legal teams that are supporting both.
Yeah, you know what, I can actually take that one, Jack. So earlier we were mentioning these revisions took anywhere from 12 to 18 months. We've got members on the pharma side of the house and the medtech side of the house. So putting together revisions that apply both to medtech and pharma, not easy, but guess what? Ethics is ethics. We really wanted to make sure when we rolled these revisions out that it worked across the board in both medtech and for pharma.
Well, sticking with you, Pat, you had talked earlier when you were talking about the revisions about value-based arrangements and safe harbors, use the air quotes. Could you please explain those two terms to us?
Yeah, sure. So what we're talking about here are results-driven and outcome-based arrangements. So traditionally, folks think back to the anti-kickback statute. I know if you're watching this and you're part of the compliance community, you're probably thinking second nature, going back to mid-'80s with anti-kickback statutes. But guess what? Some of these value-based arrangements kind of fly in the face of the anti-kickback statute. So what we wanted to do was make it clear, saying just because you don't have a safe harbor in place doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to fall outside of the safe harbor. And what do we mean by safe harbor? If you're not familiar with the term safe harbor, essentially it says just because something could potentially trigger an anti-kickback statute violation, it's not necessarily the case. You really have to look at these arrangements on a case-by-case basis, fact by fact. And the bottom line is the code applies to value-based arrangements the same as it does to any other arrangement. So I don't know if that helps clear up the picture a little bit there.
No, that does. That does. And I just want to tell you, we're just going to wrap up now. It's been a real pleasure having both of you. I'd like to sort of end with how can folks that are watching really learn more about these revisions? Where can they find them online?
Great chance to plug AdvaMed.com right here. So if you're at AdvaMed.org right now, if you go to AdvaMed.org /compliance and ethics, you can find the latest version of the AdvaMed Code. As I mentioned, June 1st was the effective date. We also have training tools that we provided for member companies and medtech companies on there. We've got one that kind of lines up exactly with what Jonathan was talking about earlier with some of the different codes globally. We've got a crosswalk that you can take a look at the revisions to the AdvaMed Code and see how that lines up to the MedTech Europe Code, see how it lines up to the MECOMed Code, see how it lines up to the Pharma Code. Very, very helpful. We've got a lot of great feedback on that one. We also have a general overview of the code revisions. We've found that compliance officers, frankly, have used this as a tool to brief their CEOs, obviously, to set up sales training. We also have a document. You mentioned value-based arrangements and some of the confusion around that. We put together a best practices, a guidance document when it comes to value-based. Found that to be very helpful for folks. And then last but not least, I want to mention a partnership we have with an organization called HealthStream. And HealthStream has worked with AdvaMed over the past few years to put together compliance programs. And I think a lot of times we focus on small companies and how these can benefit small companies, whether it's the training that AdvaMed's put together or the training with HealthStream. But frankly, the feedback I have from some of the compliance officers from our largest companies, they're using the training, they're using the course with HealthStream. So if you have any questions at all, go to the AdvaMed website, give me a call. I'm happy to help.
Nice plug. And would either of you like to just talk briefly about health disparities and how that's woven into the code and some of your materials?
Yeah, let me take a shot at that. And Jonathan, I'm going to give you the last word. As I said, thank you for joining us. But next steps in terms of AdvaMed, I mean, clearly AdvaMed has put priority on diversity and inclusion. I think you're going to see increased focus on diversity and inclusion, on patient access, on health disparities. And I think the code is a tool that we can actually demonstrate demonstrate how important diversity and inclusion is, not only to AdvaMed as an organization, but to the medtech industry in general and patient access. So Jonathan, I'll let you take it from there.
Sure. So as we think about how these tools are used in individual companies, I think one of the really clear guidances that's helpful is it's about why we do things and intentionality rather than about creating rules, which is why the code is so incredibly scalable from the smallest companies to the biggest companies. We have the right approach, and then you can add complexity to it depending on your needs. When we think about diversity, this is a place that actually the medical device space has been for a very, very long time. Whether you're thinking about orthopedic implants, whether you're talking about spinal work, whether you're talking about cardiac work, whether you're talking about respiratory, we have an amazing diversity of patients. They're all different sizes, shapes, health conditions, and needs. So the industry has spent decades designing products not for a perfect person, but for the wide diversity of people that exist out there in the world. And I would argue that we're all intrinsically the same underneath our skin, at least incredibly similar. And that's where the med device world really shines, is in all the unique parts that make people people. So it's diversity and inclusion has been a big piece, making sure that we're getting the right tools to the right patients and we're treating them the right way. And this all flows from this idea that there's an ethical way to interact with healthcare providers.
Well said.
Jonathan, very well said. And I just want to close with thanking both of you. This really shows what you were just saying there, how an industry can lead without government mandates on their own to address these very important challenges over a period of decades. So thank you both for coming here to Capitol Forum.
Appreciate it, Jack.
Thanks, Jack. Appreciate it.
Thanks. you.